All right, let's get going. We got a lot of people here. Boy, I'm looking through the names here. It's really great to see a lot of familiar names and familiar faces. And best of all, Lyle's here. Thank you, Lyle, for agreeing to do this. I'll be doing the first few minutes, 10, 15 minutes or something like that, then pretty much turn it over to Lyle, and we'll have a time for questions and answers, Q&A after that. Then we'll have a long break. Then about 2 hours from now, 3 hours from now, we'll go into the 2 hour free webinar on time adjustments, lo and behold. Um, let's see. We just keep going here. Okay, Fannie and Freddie, now what? Appraisers always ask that. Now what? Well, here's a quote from Lyle Radke about 2 years ago. See, I was taking notes, Lyle. You didn't know that. Appraisers see their jobs as an art form. It's hard for them to rigorously explain exactly what they're doing. Well, that's what this webinar is about, and the 2 hour freebie afterwards is learning how to rigorously analyze and explain what we're doing. Also, Scott Reuter said appraisers need to spend time on developing market conditions analysis in the appraisal. It's truly the backbone of the appraisal. And that's one of my best quotes from him because I've long believed that if you get the market analysis time adjustment right, a lot of other things fall in place. Before we go on, I just want to thank some of the people, the members of the community of asset analysts, John, Craig, Bruce, Kyle, Joe, who are here to help out and bail me out when I screw up. I do that every time. So everybody watch for it. There's a prize for catching me first. Okay, the overall change in guidelines as practice is what we're talking about. Well, in the past, time adjustments are not required unless they are needed. That's a quote from the Fannie Mae guidelines. Now, this is kind of a philosophical change. And Lyle, please jump in and correct me if I'm wrong, or you'll have a much longer period of time after I'm done. Failure to make market-derived time adjustments when indicated by market data is an example of unacceptable appraisal practice. So it pretty clearly says there it's got to be market-derived and it's got to be based on market data. And most of you had a chance to read that in the introductory slides. Lyle, I apologize. I think this is your old one, but I couldn't get the new one off the Fannie Mae website. But he's a great guy. I've known him for a long time. He's more scientifically oriented than most other people, and I always appreciated that about you, Lyle. Thank you. You have a college degree in something scientific. I know that. Okay, things you need to know.
Geology.
Go. Geology, right. Very good. Yeah. My cousin is a brother to me in Australia, University of Adelaide, is a geologist. Um, okay, so I'll do the introduction here, do a little outline on the GSE time adjustment requirements, just to kind of lay the table for Lyle. Uh, Name out the acceptable methods versus the most efficient methods. A really important topic. What is a market? Well, this is a question that's poorly addressed in our industry, and yet that's what we do, is market analysis. Lyle will present us with a Fannie Mae view on time adjustments required. Deadline now is March 1st, as I recall. Then we'll open up after Lyle's done to questions, answers. We do have Bruce and John and Cindy screening any questions you might have to ask of Lyle on the chat. We won't have time to answer every question, so they'll be screening them for the greatest usefulness to everybody. And then we'll wrap it up with a closing summary. I'll just do about 2 or 3, 4 minutes on that. Basically, it's what's next, where do I start? And we'll just give a quick overview of what the 2 hour webinar will cover. So the learning path, it's going to involve some learning. This webinar will follow with that 2 hour webinar that we're talking about. You're already signed up, it's the same link. You don't have to do anything else, just kind of don't turn off your computer. We will present how to do time adjustments using at least 1 or 2 methods, both in Excel spreadsheet, in R and R Studio, which many of you know is what we teach now. It's an analytics software. It's free. It's open source. And we will also show you how to do it with words. The power of artificial intelligence today lets us do things in words and basically code things. Kyle will be doing a brief presentation on that, and Craig Gilbert also will be doing that. We'll have two different types of AI software. Uh, that'll be interesting. It really speeds up the process, improves the uh, credibility and quality of what you get. StatsCrest data science class, we've been teaching this for 17, 18 years now. Uh, the focus of that class is market analysis. It's the core and the basic part of valuation. The difference there is it's hands-on. We give you the software, the data sets, and as we go through the class, you solve problems interactively online. We try to show you how to get the right data, how to use the best time series analysis, and how to make expert decisions. I'll throw this in right now. The core part of data science is that data science recognizes the need for the human expert. Statistics does not. Data science explicitly says we need you. For us, that means you, the appraiser. It's fast and fun. It's easy to explain the methods we show there, and it's repeatable. So it can actually be audited. This is me. It's a long story, but what really qualifies me to be here, I have written a couple of appraisal journal articles that were peer reviewed. Both of them, well, out of the three that I've written, two of them covered time series analysis and time adjustments. And I made fun of the old 1004 MC. If you like that, you'll enjoy it. It's in the Appraisal Journal from the Appraisal Institute. Okay, analyzing the market. Raw requirements and a practical practice. How do we put this into practice? Well, I'll be doing the introduction to current practices and overarching regulations, basically the broader picture before we get to what Fannie Mae is asking us to do and the regulations. And Lyle will, of course, focus on the guidelines and requirements. And Lyle, in particular, I think a lot of people are interested in how you're going to be dealing with lenders, underwriters, reviewers. We know what to do or not to do, but how the people that we talk to and that beat up on us, that's a lot of interest in that. So, and I think you already committed to that focus. So the intentions for implementations with lenders, underwriters, and appraisers. Why now? Well, because it's time. For me, it's 18 years too late, but that's me. Making it work. Fannie Mae hopes and intentions. That's their words, not mine. Hopes and intentions. Well, for appraisers, down at the bottom, well, where will the real motivation to do it right come from? What education, what software? We're dealing with those clients, and they are, yeah, who goes first on this education and getting things right? AMCs, state regulators, they don't know much more than we do. And then, all arrows go back up to Fannie and Freddie. Except we got the FHFA here. It's kind of looming in the background. So who's in the who's in the middle? Who's on first? Who's on second? Uh, education is going to be required. This webinar is our attempt to at least get the thing rolling in the right direction. I think it's going to need to address at every level. Otherwise, there's going to be chaos. I think this is a big deal. FHFA and GSEs. The FHFA report by Dorner and Scott Susan mentioned three different types of common strategies for doing time adjustments. One was group data, very similar to what the 1004 MC did. Paired sales, using the same or similar property at different times, and a scatter plot plus trend line using all the competitive market. The GSEs, the new guidelines say that there are various acceptable methods, including home price indexing, statistical stuff, modeling, paired sales, or, quote, other commonly accepted methods are acceptable. So it's kind of vague, but, hey, we got to start now. At least it's required. And they say clearly that the appraiser must summarize the evidence, basically show the data you used. Describe the data source. Well, for us, usually it's MLS and public records. The tools you used and the techniques you used. So evidence, data, tools, and techniques are to be summarized. So the content beyond the GSEs or before. How about USPAP? That's the bigger yard that we play on as appraisers. Well, there's two sections of the USPAP that talk about time adjustments. One is in the scope of work. The other one is Standards Rule 1-3, development of appraisals. And licensing education, which was created, what, 30 years ago? Pretty much unchanged. Oh, darn. Unfortunately, it's minimal help. The education that we do have treats time adjustments like other adjustments. And if you're an economist or a statistician, time series analysis is completely different from other types of adjustments, for lack of better words. The GSA guidelines with that nudge recently from the FHA, I don't know how heavy that was, but it's there. They're certainly poking around into our yard now. They talk about data selection in that report that came out in December. I'm sorry. The GSC guidelines talks about selecting the data, getting the right data. It talks about two separate trends, not one trend analysis, but two. And let me just relate to the old 1004 form. On the front of the form is the neighborhood. On the back of the form is your adjustments. Well, carefully reading the GSE guidelines requires two separate trends. One for the front, which is at least 12 months long, that's on the neighborhood, but competing properties. On the back of the form, getting your time adjustments is the entire competitive market, which may or may not be inside the neighborhood or outside of the neighborhood. It can go outside the neighborhood, but restricted to just competitive sales, not anything else. So two separate trends you could actually get two different numbers. We'll talk about that. And all this is basically now, March 1st. And one of the things that Lyle has said in the past that I've always liked, to help reduce the potential for bias or human error, there's 4 appraisal elements needed. And here's a scientific background: factual, objective, reproducible, and auditable. And that is our goal. And I personally think this is going to save our profession if we can work on these 4 words. The webinar, market price indexing, forms the foundation for factual, objective, and reproducible appraisal. This is the core of the direction of the path of what we at Value Metrics teach, the stats, graphs, and data science class. What is a market? A pretty important word, and yet that word is used and misused in several different meanings. I've seen it used in 3 different meanings in the same sentence. No wonder we have a problem with our profession. Okay, is this a market or a marketplace? Is this a market for apples? Yes, it is. Are there other sellers possibly in this marketplace selling in the market for selling apples? Yes. There's at least one customer there. It looks like there's another person behind there saying, hey, wait a minute, maybe those are good apples. But you know what? I've got an apple in my refrigerator. Is that part of the market? No, I'm going to eat my apple. So the definition, understanding what is a market and a marketplace and a market segment for apples. Do green apples compete with red apples? So sometimes things that seem clear aren't so clear. We'll just go on here. In our teaching, we talk about the competitive market segment. So it's clear that we're talking about what competes with the subject property on that data value directly. A buyer would look at both properties as a choice. And we call that the CMS, or the competitive market segment. Okay, appraisal standards. Standards Rule 1-3 clearly says market area trends, and if basically you're in violation if you make an unsupported assumption like, oh, I think this market's level. I think this is the big change for the now, for the near future. Now you got to support that zero adjustment. Where did it come from? The same way of getting to a zero is the same as getting an upward or a downward trend analysis. Just zero has to be supported. The scope of work rule talks about that a lot also. And it's a little bit broader. The type and extent of data researched. Well, for us, the research could involve more than the competitive market segment, but what's really relevant is what competes directly. And results require support by relevant evidence. Well, what's relevant is the competitive data. And finally, relevant characteristics. Is it living area? Is it view? Is it swimming pool? Is it industrial property? Is it a gas station? It's got to be similar. Okay, now one more look here on the education we've all gotten over the last 20, 30 years, which has had very little change. But here's what the Appraisal of Real Estate says, the current edition. Market analysis serves two important functions. First, a background against local developments, folks. It doesn't say the city or the state or the region. It says local, which is what we do best for a living, analyzing local market conditions. Second, understanding broad changes for supply and demand gives an appraiser an indication of how values change over time. Again, a reference to time adjustments market analysis. Also, the data and conclusions generated through market analysis are essential components in other portions of the valuation process. I am so thrilled to be here and having Lyle here, and these changes, they're going to be tough for a while. But personally, I think this may save the appraisal profession. It's going to force some changes on us, but they're going to be good changes. They will be good for our clients. They'll be good for Fannie Mae. They'll be good for getting rid of unfounded complaints against us. I think this is a beginning point of a good path for our profession. One sentence was taken out of the 15th edition. It was in the 14th edition of the Appraisal of Real Estate. Was in fact, most of the time and effort involved in the valuation process are devoted to market analysis, which includes collecting, verifying, and analyzing data. For some reason, they took this sentence out in the 15th edition. I think that's kind of going backwards because this is the forward-looking view on data analysis. The selling guide. Different methods acceptable to provide supporting evidence. Failure to make market-derived time adjustments. Market-derived, when indicated by market data, is unacceptable. That's a direct quote out of the GSE guidelines. Time adjustments and appraisal. Appraisal reports must summarize all evidence and describe the data sources, tools, and techniques. We covered that already, but there you are again. Data sources, tools, and techniques, and describe all supporting. This is from the old Freddie Mac guideline, and I don't know if that's changed or not, but Freddie has basically, I'll let this thing run very quickly, have a sip of water while it's running. It says it has always said must include time adjustments. In fact, I believe the Fannie Mae guideline always said that, just everybody ignored it. It was a groupthink. Nobody else does it, so I don't need to do it either, and off we go down the path. Market conditions over the period analyzed. That means it's got to be over the relevant time period analyzed, and it's got to be supported by data, by comparables. So I get this repeat message throughout everything that I read, and it's got to be explained. So again, Bill Dorner's and Scott Susan's paper it came out in November. They said associations between this is the bias issue, folks. They found under appraisal was related to whether time adjustments were done or not and how big they were. They did find that time adjustments are grossly and consistently underutilized. As low as 10% of house appraisals were coming in with no time adjustment. I mean, 90% with no time adjustments. Even when the market was hot and going up dramatically, it never went over much more than 40 or 50%. They also said that it looks like Appraiser sees as a technical challenge. It's too hard to do, therefore I won't do it. Hopefully you'll see before the end of today that it's really not that hard. It's just new. As my friend Bruce says, it's not hard, it's just new. Undue influence of lender institutions. They acknowledge that we get pressure from lenders and clients and AMCs. Oh, shucks. At least they recognize that. You know, we've gone for decades without anybody pointing that out, so it's easy to miss that. They were criticized for using Zillow. I'm not going to take a position on that. It was a weird application of Zillow stuff.
Hey,
But they did.
George, let me
Oh,
jump in on
please
the
jump
Zillow
in.
point real quick.
Absolutely.
At Fannie Mae, we have alternatives to Zillow. Like we don't use Zillow, and we've got UCDP data. We've got various models. The essential points that their analysis or conclusions that their analysis reached are supported no matter what models you use. Like you can throw out the Zillow thing, use any model you want, you'll find the same thing.
Very good. Thank you. Hopefully I won't go much longer here. This is your show, not mine, but I just felt
No, you're
necessary.
doing great. Doing
Oh, thank
fantastic.
you. I wanted to lay the table on certainly the USPAP and other background where how this happens. They found there were several methods. The most common method used by appraiser was avoid it. Cover your eyes, don't see it, leave the field blank. I think that's the major change now, is that field is required. Period. Even if it's a zero, it's got to have that number in it, and it's got to be supported. Why is it zero? Why are you saying the market is absolutely flat? And basically, they said that this paper's shortfalls and that documents the shortfalls in an understudied element of appraisal using a time adjustment. Those are words to my heart because I've been trying to teach time adjusted market analysis, a core part of the data science approach to valuation. So I'm really excited, and that's why we're here. And thank you again, Lyle, for agreeing to be here. This is terrific. You're certainly serving my ego and my motives here. Let's rate it to bias because that was a triggering part of this. In USPAP, it says a preference inclination that precludes IIO, independence, impartiality, or objectivity. In practice, it's a difference between opinions focused or data evidence focused valuation. Data focused evidence reduces or eliminates actual or perceived bias. Actual or perceived or lied bias. And it can eliminate unwarranted accusations of appraisal bias. I think I've been misunderstood so here on both sides of the political spectrum. I'm just saying, if you do it right, the bias issue goes away. Yeah, the exaggeration. But if you do it right, it becomes really hard to unreasonably be accused of bias. Bias can be personal, it can be conscious, it can be unconscious, and it can be analytical. Until our industry and the politics behind it realizes that there's two kinds of bias. One is personal, one is analytical. Until we learn to separate which is which, we're going to be just talking past each other. Two parts of time adjustment, two ingredients. One is a change in the value of the dollar. Basically, that's the measuring stick stretching out. Sometimes general inflation it's pretty fast. It's been fairly high recently. And the rest of the time adjustment is the competitive market segment itself, the price levels within your competing market. The CMS must contain similar properties that are competitive to each other and that are able to be compared. These three words are the only definitions of a comparable that I've been able to find anywhere, and that's in the 15th edition of the Appraisal Journal. It's got to be similar, competitive, and able to be compared. That's a comp. That's the best we can do. Thank you, Lyle, our guest presenter for our revised series. And thank you again. Lyle worked with me like in 2021 last time, and it was a big issue then because the market was going crazy, and now you're the cause of the problem, Lyle. Market conditions, time adjustments, bias elements, and I will turn it over to you for about half an hour or so. I'll wrap it up with a few minutes at the end. We'll open it up to questions and answers whenever you're ready, Lyle. It's your baby. Thank you.
Sounds good, George. And you did a great job setting this up. I almost feel like I don't have too much that I need to say here. I'll share a quick story though. I do have a master's degree in geology. So I wrote a master's thesis on a geology science project, right? Think elementary school science project on steroids, right? And part of that was learning to collect and analyze and display data for the reader, draw conclusions from the data. You couldn't draw your conclusion first and then go find data to prove it because your editor was going to eat you alive, right? Because you had smart people looking at the same data set. That was part of that's another part of this transparency. You share your data so that everybody gets to take a shot at it and say, no, that's not how I interpret it, right? And I can't remember when this was, George, but when I first came to Fannie Mae, there weren't a lot of people talking about concepts of accuracy, for example, because USPAP anchors in credibility. If you're believable, is that the same thing as being true, right? So I always thought about things in terms of accuracy as being better than credible. And accuracy is what businesses need. It's not enough to be believable. If you're wrong, the business still goes off the cliff, right? So you have to be right. You can't. It's not just good enough to be plausible. Transparent. That's another word I use, which is the same thing as auditable. It's like, don't hide anything. You share it, and you have to be accountable for all of the data, not just a part of the data. And then reproducible. This comes from my background in appraisal review. There were many cases where we would get more than one appraisal on a property, and I can't tell you how many times they disagreed. When we're hiring a professional and we're all in agreement on the scope of work and the data sources, small disagreements we can sort of tolerate, but big disagreements, very large disagreements, why? Right? It's not reproducible if that's the case. So those are really my passions. And I was at some event, appraiser event, and I was speaking about this, and I mentioned it, I guess. And this was the first time I remember meeting George. He came up to me afterwards, and he's like, "Lyle, got to talk to you, right? This reproducibility, this transparency. These are big issues, anchored in data. Here's my card." Data science, right? Value metrics. We need to work together on this. And so I appreciate his enthusiasm. And now to kind of see these concepts working into the appraiser consciousness and into the continuing education spectrum, that's very wonderful thing to see. And I do think George is right. I don't know if it saves the profession specifically, because I don't know that the profession is at risk and needing to be saved, but it's certainly going to improve the profession and make us more professional. So let me talk a little bit about the announcement. And I think George did a great job of summarizing it. If you haven't seen one of my presentations before, our legal department requires me to show you this disclaimer, which says anything I can say, you can't hold it against me because the selling guide rules. So I'll try and be consistent with the selling guide. But if I'm inconsistent with the selling guide, see the selling guide. In any case, here is some data. And I would give you 2024, but we don't have it quite collated yet. We have an appraisal review branch, a quality control branch that samples many thousands of appraisals every year, and we have appraisal reviewers, experts who look at those appraisals, and we give them best possible data and tools to try and analyze the quality of those appraisals. And when they find something that's a problem, they cite it, and we cite those as defects, right? So this is a little tally of defects, appraisal defects from 2023, and the numbers, I'm not sure that they really matter, but the thing I want to draw your attention to is that 2 of the top 3 categories are adjustments: inadequate comparable adjustments and failure to adjust, which is like 0 adjustment, the mega inadequate. Now, we also see sometimes excessive adjustment, but honestly, that's a lot less of a problem than failure to adjust. And I think this is part of the psyche of appraisers, and where we're at today is that we are hesitant to go out on a limb with what you might call aggressive adjustments. We would tend to minimize adjustments. And I think there's a couple of reasons for that. And I think that's really at the heart of what George is trying to accomplish here. Reason number 1 is because lenders don't get adjustments, and adjustments are troubling to underwriters. So when you do adjustments, that's something they might challenge. And I said, why did you adjust for time? That comp's only 3 months old. You might hear that. And the other is just that degree of difficulty. It's like, I'm uncertain what I should adjust. Therefore, it's better to be safe and not adjust anything. I think there's some old habits too of like big adjustments are bad, small adjustments are better, from old rules around 10% line item, 15% net, 25% gross, which those guidelines were in place when I came into the profession, but we always misunderstood those. Those weren't limits to how much you could adjust. You adjust what the data tells you to adjust. You comment when the adjustments exceed the limits. So those limits were intended to trigger transparency, explanation. They were not intended to suppress adjustments. And I think we've misinterpreted them since as long as I've been in the business, right? So that's really important to understand, is that I'll say this another way, and I know there are folks who disagree with me on this, but I would argue comp selection, in a certain sense, wouldn't matter if we really knew how to adjust well. Because you could adjust for any difference if you could analyze what that difference is. And you see this play out like in rural markets or thin markets where there's not a lot of data. You sometimes don't get to pick your best comps because they just don't exist, right? What you would call an ideal comp doesn't exist. You have to take what's there. You have to analyze the market based on the real data that actually exists, whether it's good and clean or whether it's messy and ugly. You're dealt the hand that you're dealt, right? And you can't just say, no, I'm not going to analyze the market. You got to make sense of it somehow. So comps that are not comps sometimes are a necessary evil of the process. You've got to use what you have. And you can do that if you really know how to do adjustments well. So comp selection becomes less important if you can do adjustments well. On the other hand, comp selection doesn't cure the lack of ability to do adjustments well. You can still get way off base. You can use all the best comps. If you don't adjust them well, you can still get way off base. So this list here is cases where we actually made we sent the appraisal in question to the state for investigation. Now, you might look at this and say, oh my gosh, Lyle, 1,000 referrals to states for adjustment, for inadequate adjustments. Yeah, it really happened. But some of the appraisals that went to states had more than one issue. So this is all the issues, not all the appraisals. We did actually send about 1,000 appraisals to states in 2023. That's out of 8 million that we received, so it's a very small rate. But if you're concerned about getting a nastygram from Fannie Mae or getting a nastygram from your state, you need to learn how to do adjustments well, because that's the top 2 of the top 3 drivers of those nastygrams are failure to do adjustments well. George covered this. I'm just going to be a little bit more comprehensive about it. We had these 5 selling guide updates in November. We issued new definitions of neighborhood and market. We clarified how you should think about comparable sales selection relative to market area. We established this minimum time frame of 12 months for the overall market trend. So George said there's two trends you're doing, right? The first trend is your neighborhood trend on page 1 of the URAR. That's based on 12 months or longer. But time adjustments are not based on 12 months or longer. They are based on from the contract date of the comp to the effective date of the appraisal, which could be, any kind of, depends on the comp, right? So you have to be able to develop time adjustments that fit the time period that's under question. We also talked about this requirement to support, and we just wanted to make that super clear. So these policies are required to be implemented by February 4th. But the other policy about not making time adjustments is an unacceptable appraisal practice. That actually is the effective date is March 1st. So I saw in the chat someone brought up the February 4th date. George referenced the March 1st date. They're both true. They're just for different sets of changes. Okay, these are the definitions of neighborhood and market area. And here's how I would think about it. A neighborhood is a geographic unit, right? And it's a fixed geographic unit. If you determine that a property is in a certain neighborhood and you therefore have defined that neighborhood, every property that's in that neighborhood is always in that neighborhood because it's just a thing. It's a neighborhood. It's not a flexible thing. The neighborhood doesn't change from one assignment to the next. It doesn't change from one property to the next. It's always the neighborhood, right? Market area, though, is different. So market is a geographic region, but it's a more fluid concept because it's tied to the market itself, the geographic region from which most demand comes and in which most of the competition is located. All right, that may change depending upon the nature of your subject property. So, for example, I may have a neighborhood with some mixed usage. Maybe it's got some single-family detached. Maybe it's got some townhomes. The market area for the townhomes may be very different than the market area for the single-family detached, even though they might sit side by side in the same neighborhood, right? So market area is an assignment-specific problem. You have to analyze what is the competition for your subject. Whereas neighborhood is not assignment-specific. It's a fixed effect. It's always the same for a given property. And then again, George did a great job talking about this, the changes, but I wanted to drill down to the actual selling guide language here. So here's your reference. If you want to look this up yourself, I would encourage it. In fact, we have recently hosted our selling guide online in a way that's very Google searchable. You can put in Fannie Mae selling guide and a keyword and it'll drop you right to this section. So you don't have to, the selling guide is 1,300 pages long. It's a contract. It's essentially a contract with lenders. And you don't want to have to read that whole thing. I haven't read the whole thing. But pretty close, but not quite, right? So you can Google and find these things real easily, but I'm going to make it easy for you. Unacceptable appraisal practices is part B4-1.1.04, and we got a long list of them. But one of the things on that list, the new thing on the list, is failure to make market-derived adjustments, including time adjustments. Maybe we beat that horse to death, right? Then in the adjustment to comparable sales section, we've got this new language. This is new. A home price index, HPI, may be used, and George read through all this. In all instances, the appraiser must provide an explanation and must support the time adjustment or lack thereof. So the question's been asked, why? Why now? And I think there's a lot of reasons to that, but I'll point to a couple of things. And I think this will help you understand how FHFA has gotten involved in this. So first of all, we have a great relationship with FHFA. They are our regulator and our conservator, but we also communicate regularly, and we share data and insights. And FHFA has multiple things that they have to be accountable for in relation to the GSEs. So one of them is our safety and soundness. Safety and soundness is kind of a financial question. Like, are we adequately capitalized for the risk we're taking? Are we adequately priced for the risk that we're taking? And if you then take that question and you say, well, what's our pricing model? What's the Fannie Mae's revenue model? We get paid based on the loan to value ratio and the property type are two of the key ingredients in our pricing model. So in order for us to collect the appropriate guarantee fee from the lender, which is like an insurance premium, we need to know the true value of the property, and we need to know truly what type of property it is. There's a few other things that go into the pricing model, but those are really important. So getting the value right is extremely important. If the value is, let's say, inflated, then our pricing model is thrown off. And that affects our safety and soundness. And I'll talk about how time adjustments affect that a little later. But at a minimum, appraisal quality is extremely important to our safety and soundness, and FHFA recognizes that. Now, there's also another aspect of FHFA's oversight, which is our mission. And our mission is to provide liquidity to the marketplace. And liquidity in the mortgage markets is a very broad concept. So let's say you're in Nome, Alaska, and the nearest appraiser is 1,000 miles away and has to fly in an airplane. Is that a liquidity problem? Potentially, right? Do we have access to mortgage credit financing throughout the United States, because this is federal? And do we do it in a way that provides liquidity to all the eligible borrowers? So if the appraisal is biased in some way, then that may affect liquidity in the marketplace. Certain borrowers who are impacted by the bias would then be disadvantaged, right? So that's a theory. I'm not accusing anybody of being biased. I'm just saying theoretically, an idea of appraisal bias affects the liquidity function of FHFA. So they're very interested in that. These are statutory functions. They can't dodge them. They have to do this. Now, so they're going to study this, right, to try and find out if they're meeting their statutory obligations. And I think that's the root cause of the paper that George referenced. Right, let's talk about this graph a little bit. Now, this illustrates the difference between the neighborhood time series, which is the 1 year minimum time series, versus the time adjustment or market change adjustment. And so first, let me level set. You do not need to have this chart in your appraisal report. That is a misunderstanding based on a tiny typo in our announcement where we ended a word in a D instead of an S and got misconstrued. But you do not need to do this graph. This graph is for educational purposes. That said, what it's showing is here we have a 12-month period from January to December. And the market from January to December increased by, actually this starts at 1%. So that's kind of weird. But if you go 1 to 7%, it increased by 6%, right? So your neighborhood trend is 6% for the year. It's an increasing trend. But if you take any one of these comps from their effective date or their contract date to the effective date, you can see that there's different trends for each comp, depending on how that market evolved over that 12-month period. Now, you may not always have enough data to generate this level of intelligence around your market, but you got to try, right? And I think that's what George wants to show you is You can squeeze a lot more out of the data than you realize if you're using good analytical techniques. Here's some other resources that I just wanted to point you to. We've been talking about this for a long time. In our quarterly appraiser newsletter, for those of you who don't know, Fannie Mae publishes an appraisal update newsletter on a quarterly basis. We've done this since 2017. So what is that? I don't know, 26, 27 quarters running. And there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 articles right here that are about adjustments and deriving your adjustments and supporting your adjustments and all this work that we're talking about. And then there's this statement also from the selling guide. The appraiser must provide appropriate comments reflecting the logic and reasoning for the adjustments provided. Okay, that's our policy. And when you agree to do an appraisal assignment to Fannie Mae requirements, you're agreeing to do that, right? So now, if you don't do that, ethics provision kicks in addition to development. A statement only recognizing that an adjustment has been made is not acceptable. And we see this all the time. Appraiser in their reconciliation gives a list. I adjust $5,000 for the bathroom and $3,000 for the bedroom and $10,000 for the view, but they don't tell why. They don't tell where those numbers came from, right? We can see in the grid what the numbers are. You don't have to repeat it, but where did that number come from is the really important thing. All right, I'm going to leave this up here for just a minute because we got some scan me's so you can get to that newsletter, which I think is a great resource. But now I want to kick it back to you, George. Let's do some Q&A.
All right. Well, I'll turn it over to Cindy or John or Bruce to handle that. Boy, we've got a lot of questions and comments on the chat. Busy, busy, busy. Some really good stuff. And I apologize. I'm not in charge of this part of it. Was that you, John, going to handle this?
Yeah, I think that's me.
Oh, good.
Cindy's been forwarding me questions, so I'm assuming it's me.
The guy with the hair.
Yeah, let me. Oh, okay, wait, there's the questions. So let's start with the first question we got, and that was the use of contract dates instead of the closed sale dates. In some areas, there's no way to get contract dates. And in other areas, there's no way to verify all of your data points that what the contract price was at the time of the contract date. So what is the GSE's position on using sale date instead of contract date?
Well, if contract date is available, then that's the preferred date because that's when the meeting of the minds happened. But if contract date is not available, then sale date is an acceptable substitute, yes.
So when we're developing time adjustments, most likely we are using sale date and sale price to determine the market trends. In which case, to me, I would then apply that to the sale dates of the comparables because that's what the market trend was based on. Any comment on that?
The gap between contract date and sale date is usually pretty small. And if you're talking about amendments to the contract, then the gap becomes even smaller, right?
Right.
So it might be a distinction without very much importance. And you know, I would frame it this way. Theoretically, the meeting of the mind happens as of the contract date. Both parties are in agreement on the price. So theoretically, that's the correct date. However, if it's not available, that's fine. If there's an amendment date and you know it, that's fine, right? And I would say I will kick this back to appraisers. You need to think about what you're doing and think about why you're doing it. It's really important to understand the theory because you're going to run into all kinds of wrinkles like this where you're going to say, well, I learned in class I should do it this way, but now I'm having trouble because of this and this. You have to be able to think on your feet and say, how do I accomplish the same objective with the data that I actually have? Because that's the challenge, right? That's what makes you the expert. So again, contract date is best, but if it's unavailable or if for some other reason it's not going to work for this particular comp, okay, go with the sale price, go with the amendment date, go with the sale date. Give us what you have and tell us why you did it. Now, the other thing to think about is, to Mr. Dorner's point in the paper, we see the same thing, that appraisers largely avoid time adjustments. Yeah, I don't know if 90% is the right figure. It bounces around a little bit depending on market conditions, but it's very high. And I'm going to argue that something here is better than nothing. If you're not using either date, then starting to use one date or the other is a step in the right direction. Like we're not going to quibble with progress. Right now we have nothing. Let's do something. Okay.
Right. All right. Thank you. How about any guidance for rural markets where data could be limited? Or it's going to be the same expectation for rural markets versus urban or suburban markets, I'm assuming. And in that case, the use of an HPI or something like that may be better off.
So I'm going to go back to this chart for a second. And, if you're in a suburban market where there's a lot of homogeneity and a lot of data, you might be able to parse the market trend out on a month-by-month basis. But if you're in that rural market, maybe you can't do this. Maybe there's just not enough data density. Maybe if you increase data by expanding your search parameters, your geographic parameters, maybe you water down the meaning of that data, right? So it's going to be harder in low density markets. And this will be true not just of rural, but let's say you have sort of more or less unique property in a urban or suburban setting, you have kind of the same problem, right? Mm-hmm. I would say you do the best you can. And we've tried to make this clear in our policy. We're not going to quibble with any tool or technique that you choose, so long as it's anchored to professional expectations. There's a lot of material out there. George is doing this class, but there's a lot of other classes that are talking about other kinds of techniques, and there are HPIs, there are models, there's lots of things that you can look to try and get some insights. It's better to do something, even if it's uncertain, than to do nothing. And I think in a rural market, there's statewide HPIs. You could say, I don't know what the home price change is in this little town, but I do know that nationally the home price change is 6%. And for our state, it's a little slower, it's 4%. So I'm going to use 4% because that's the best I have. You're going to be closer using 4% than using 0%, generally speaking. And if you think that 0% is closer than 4%, you must have a reason for that. Tell us what the reason is, right? That's what we're looking for.
Right. I think that's a misunderstanding. Go ahead, Bruce.
Lyle, Bruce Hahn, a question to clarify that. If you're in a rural market with 1,000 population small town, wouldn't it be reasonable if you can find other small towns nearby to possibly look at the median price for the most recent sales in those towns and see if there's a difference or a time adjustment? Or the same thing if you're in a rural part, not in a town. Look at adjacent counties and see if they're similar, and if an adjustment's required for location, make it, and then you could still derive some time adjustment. Would that be fair?
Absolutely. Yes. That is what I mean by getting past this mechanical approach and really understanding the principle. Okay. What data do you have? What are the sort of analogous situations? How would you make this? And that seems perfectly plausible to me. If I grew up in rural Illinois, there were 10 schools in our sports league that all were small towns and corn-fed communities, right? The economic influences were pretty similar for most of those towns. Aggregate them, sure, right? It makes sense. What are the big drivers of market change? You got to understand this, right? A lot of it is interest rates. A lot of it is supply and demand. New construction is sort of an offset. Employment is an offset. So you can look at the macroeconomic picture and say, well, it makes sense that we would be appreciating like everybody else. because our interest rate environment is the same as everybody else's. Our supply demand ratio or months on market is similar to everybody else's, right? We haven't suffered any employment shocks. If you can make those kinds of arguments, now you can open it up and say, I'll use other data that from similar situations. Perfectly fine, right? Perfectly fine. Again, it's much better to do that. And even if you don't get it, let's say perfect, that's a lot better than just saying, oh, I'm afraid to say anything. I'm just not going to do anything.
Right. Thank you. That's good information. I know in the future format for the URAR, we're going to be losing the increasing, stable, and decreasing checkboxes in the neighborhood. But until that happens, the GSEs have never come out with any sort of definition for what's increasing versus stable versus decreasing. You know, is 3% a year increasing? Is that stable? I mean, if that's the case, you know, at what point is anything stable? Because we all know absolute zero is never going to happen anywhere in any market. Market's always changing. So is there any guidance on those terms?
It's a great observation. Everything that person said is true. And since we haven't provided policy guidance, I cannot give you a policy definition. But what I will say is two things. First of all, appraisers are really bad at this. And Fannie Mae decades ago stopped paying any attention to what appraisers say about this. Like, check whatever you want. I don't care, because we're not reading it. We don't care what you think. We're going to look to our analytics to find out whether the market is changing. Now, that's not true of the comps. What you do to the comps still matters. But on page 1, it doesn't really matter. Think about it through the plausibility lens. If your client has access to market data and you're saying something about the neighborhood that differs from what they might anticipate, then you should probably be explaining that. If you're saying something that sort of matches what you would think they would anticipate, then you probably need to put less explanation into it. I think there should be a little tolerance. For me personally, if you're 1 or 2 or 3% either side of that zero, then you're pretty stable. If you start to get out there 4, 5, 6% on either side of that zero line, you're probably increasing or decreasing. But that's just me. Like, there's really no definition.
Okay. All right. That's clear as mud. But that's okay. I think you're right. It comes down to the appraiser, and they need to determine that for themselves and go from there. And I think as long as
the
you're
one thing I would
consistent-
caution is when the HPIs, which are in the public domain, are saying that markets are appreciating 20% annually, which is what we had in 2020, 2021, and appraisers 50, 60, 70% of the time are marking stable, it undermines your credibility. Like, no one believes you anymore when you say that. So don't say that. Now, right now, we're in a much more stable environment, so it's a little more nuanced.
Okay, so what HPIs are Fannie Mae using? This has come up in several of the questions. What HPIs are being used by Fannie Mae?
We have our own proprietary HPI, but all of the HPIs are in general agreement. So that's the interesting thing is, like, I'm not going to nitpick which HPI you want to use if you want to use one. I think George might argue don't use them at all. Use a different technique, right? Which is actually even better. But an HPI might be a fallback. It might be useful in a lot of situations where maybe you don't have a lot of data, or whether you're having a hard time, getting a good, clean answer out of the data. Then HPI is, from our point of view, it's better than nothing. It's acceptable. And I would say any HPI is better than nothing. As for which HPIs are the best, I really do think that FHFA's HPI is one of the best because they have such an enormous amount of information, and it's public domain, so it's easy to access. Don't know if that helps.
No, I think that does help, because that's coming up quite a bit, or HBIs, and what methods can appraisers use to come up with time adjustments? And like you said earlier, there's several different ways to do this, and George is going to argue for price indexing, which you're not specifying what type of method or model to use to come up with time adjustments. Fannie Mae
You could
is just
do, so
saying,
you could do some crazy things, right? You could consult 3 HPIs and run George's method and run 2 other methods and do paired sales, and you might get 6 or 8 different answers. This is overkill. Like you're right now, all the appraisers on the call are like, Lyle, I haven't got 12 hours to knock this thing out, right? Well, I get it, but some of these things are pretty easy. If you, it's in a theoretical perspective, it's better to use more than one technique and then compare them to each other because they critique each other, right? If you use 2 or 3 different unrelated techniques and you get the same answer, that's powerful. If you get directionally similar answers, that's nearly as powerful, right? So I would say it's more about if there's information that's easily accessible to your client or the intended user or Fannie Mae or the homeowner, someone who's going to be reading your report, and you pretend like it doesn't exist and then don't say anything about that topic, you reduce your credibility. You have to assume that the people reading your report are knowledgeable, and they're going to come in with their preconceptions based on the stuff that's in the public domain that they know, that they have access to. And so, unfortunately, we're in a little bit of a defensive posture right now as appraisers, where we are being criticized. And part of that's because there is a lot of data out there, and there is a lot of transparency, whether you like it or not. And so people are going to challenge. And I'll tell you, coming from that science background, that's the norm for science. Scientists get nasty with each other. There's all kinds of, historic feuds like Hatfield and McCoy's between 2 scientists with 2 different points of view arguing back and forth about the same set of data and the same problems. This is okay. This is not a bad thing. This is how society learns and progresses, is by challenging each other. So you shouldn't think of this as being bad. Transparency is good. It's going to help us all get better. But you have to assume that transparency exists, and you have to address the elephants in the room, whatever they happen to be.
Hey, Lyle, there's a lot of comments from people that I think show frustration with change, is the way I would say it. And I think people are looking for the one way to do this. Maybe I could throw an idea at you and see if you think that's fair and like your feedback on it. I think what I'm hearing from you is now's a time more than ever where you really want to expand your appraiser skill set. You want to take as many courses as you can in appraisal methodology, probably from credible sponsors of the Appraisal Foundation, the Institute, the Farm Managers Rural Appraisers, ASA, the like. And you probably want to read established textbooks like Appraising Residential Properties from the Appraisal Institute and make sure that your skill set on all the methodologies that are applicable are up to date. What I'm hearing you say is as long as you use some generally accepted method, perhaps even what George teaches in his stats, graphs, and data science, you'll be fine. And maybe more than one way. Maybe use an index and some market. Does that sound fair to you?
That sounds very fair. Yes. Use at least one technique. Use the best one you can find. Use more than one if you have that luxury. Don't use 0 techniques. That's not going to be good in going forward. First of all, we've made it unacceptable in our policy. But it was already unacceptable under USPAP, right? No unsupported assumptions.
Just a good time to expand your skill sets as an appraiser.
Right.
Thanks.
So on top of that, that's, those are techniques that I use. I'm in a market of a city of 350,000, so we generally have plenty of data when I'm in the city. But you go 15 minutes north, and you're in the boonies, and you have a couple of homes scattered here and a couple of homes scattered there. So I think what people need to realize is that there are techniques available out there, whether you're relying on those 5 sales that happened in the past year in that small community. You can develop a trend on that. Is it reliable? Maybe, maybe not. but I'm going to supplement that with maybe data from Bakersfield here, where there's tons of data, and then I can reconcile the two to some sort of time adjustment. And if that fails, I can go to, you know, other smaller communities that are around Bakersfield that might better compete with that small neighborhood, and reconcile those to something. So I think there are techniques out there, and like Bruce was saying, it's a matter of improving your skills, learning some techniques, taking one of George's classes or any of the other classes that are out there on developing adjustments. But market condition adjustments are probably the most important adjustment that we can be making out there. Because if you can narrow your market down to some similar sales, then the rest of it is probably going to fall in place a lot better after we've made those market condition adjustments. And we've had a
Couldn't
couple
agree
comments.
more. Couldn't agree more. And I'll add that the first time you do it, if this is your first time, is the hardest time. Once you've done it 2 or 3 times, it gets a lot easier, right?
Absolutely. And, you know, I do get criticism coming back every once in a while, you know, someone, a lender using an HPI for the entire MSA of Bakersfield. And well, it's just not relevant. I mean, Bakersfield is a huge market. It's 26 miles across, or they use an entire, I think the MSA covers the entire county of Kern, which spans 4 hours driving at 70 miles an hour. So the HPI for the MSA of Bakersfield isn't super relevant. So I have to, you know, comment about that in reports occasionally, because someone will look at that HPI, and I just have to say it's not relevant for all of the markets that we're looking at. So I think that's something that you need to be aware of when you're making market condition adjustments and not using some HPI, is to know, like Lyle said, there are published HPIs out there that everybody has access to. So it can be scary the first time you're doing this and you're getting feedback saying, hey, the market's increasing. Well, you know, look at my charts in here, look at the information I've provided for you, and this is what this particular market segment is doing. And that's one of the questions that it has been in here several times is, you know, what type of evidence are you looking for? Are graphs required as evidence for the market condition adjustments, or what else is acceptable as evidence in the reports?
In terms of the evidence, again, we're not very prescriptive. I would say to the appraiser, we've asked you to be quantitative and in deriving your adjustment rates from market data. So the evidence that you need to provide is how you did that. So it's very wide open. Like, whatever you did, tell us about it. Now, here's another way to think about it is let's say that you were audited by your state board for whatever reason, and they ask you for your work file. And you know, when they ask you for the work file, they're going to go over it real carefully. They're going to challenge the stuff in your report. So if you're making, let's say, adjustments, whether it's time adjustments or square footage adjustments, whatever adjustment, they're going to look in that work file to try and figure out where those adjustments came from, right? And you want a solid justification there because your license is on the line, right? These are the cops. You're trying to defend your point of view. Well, whatever you put in your work file to defend your point of view to the state, seems like that might be really appropriate for your report in this new paradigm. If not all of it, at least a summary of it. Capture what you're thinking. It may force you to think a little more than you want to sometimes, but that's the job. That's what we are. We're professional thinkers.
This is George. I really appreciate the way this conversation is going. One of the things we teach, of course, is the ideal method. But as a part of getting to that ideal method, we realize that sometimes that's impossible because of lack of data, how bad the data is, the competence of the person. Actually, I presented this issue to the head guy at Farmer Mac, because we often get people saying, George, your method doesn't work if you only got 2 comps. Well, that's true. So how do you expand that data? How do you go back further in time? There's so much differentiation. You know, the folks from Kansas, your best comp is 23 miles away and the next one's 76 miles away. How do you handle it? So we try to deal with this issue of what if you can't be perfect? Then how? And that requires competence and understanding and a level of comfort. And if you understand the ideal, now you can explain yourself to the reader. Please go ahead, John.
I would just throw out one other thought. I've been doing this for 35 years. When I started taking appraisal coursework at the beginning of that period, the focus was on market analysis, and part of that included analyzing base employment for a community and seeing if there's a change in it and how that would impact the market. And I would just throw out that it's probably very important to do that in your market from time to time, to look at all the factors that contribute to the direction of the market. And then when you're looking at some of these things, somebody posed a question, can I interview realtors for the direction of the market? Well, that's great backup support, but that doesn't analyze data. You could certainly do that, but that can't be what you rely on solely. So you have to do enough analysis, I think, to be able to determine where things are going and to be able to clearly explain, hey, this is what I looked at, and this is why I believe this is the right direction. It's not just a one size fits all single approach. You have to look at a lot of different things. You may only rely on one or two things, but you should be considering a lot. Is that fair?
Yeah, and I think it is situational specific. So, you could imagine a scenario like I live in Plano, Texas. It's the prototypical suburb. Everything's homogeneous, mostly cookie cutter type stuff, right? Lots and lots of great data for appraisers. I'll probably have the Plano Appraiser Coalition after me after this call saying, no, it's not that easy, Radke. But you compare that to maybe your rural community outside of Bakersfield. And in Plano, the HPI is probably right because it's a simplified population. In the rural market, the HPI might be wrong because it's not a simple market and it's not a data-rich market. Anytime you start to get out of a very homogeneous, data-rich environment, then you're going to have to start to criticize the standardized methods. So you criticize the HPI because maybe it doesn't apply to that small town or to that, multi-million-dollar mansion or whatever. And when you do that, the way you criticize it then is with that economics lens that you just talked about. So you're going to say, the reason why the HPI for Bakersfield doesn't apply to this little town is because the economics are different. It's, something about the employment or something about the commute or something about the population growth or whatever, right? That comes from your knowledge base and your study. So in order to criticize the outputs of any of these standardized techniques, you have to have a grasp of the economics that underlie the market.
Steve Smith, appraiser extraordinaire, has a question. Unmute yourself, Steve.
I don't know if he can. Steve, you can post it in the chat.
Do we have other questions? Happy to take more questions.
We I'm trying to keep up.
Yeah.
Trying to wade through the 70 comments that are flowing through, and
We can go on about another 15 minutes, and we'll take about a half-hour break before the webinars. The
Bruce
class starts.
unmuted me.
okay, Steve, you've been unmuted.
Yeah. I just would like to contribute that any national trend analysis, statewide trend analysis, doesn't get us to where we need to be. It doesn't matter what the state did. We're dealing with a market segment within a city or a neighborhood. And we, amongst all of the people involved in real estate and real estate economics, we are the only ones with boots on the ground with access to the data to measure the local market trend.
Sounds like more of a statement than a question, but no, I don't disagree. Like the national aggregate HPI is not very meaningful for an appraiser. Statewide aggregates, not very meaningful. As you
I
drill
did-
down, they become more meaningful, but sometimes it's all you have, right? And something is better than nothing in this situation.
Lyle, I did have a question on your chart
Okay.
because it exemplifies what I'm experiencing in my Inland Empire Riverside County market. That the market might have been going up the first half of last year, and then it sort of stalled during the summer, and then slowly started down about September. But my experience, whether the market's going up or going down, is once it starts a new direction, it starts out slowly. And so September might have gone down a half, November 3/4, December 1% or 1.5%. So it's sort of irrelevant if we're using a time adjustment for the length of time of our sales, not for an annualized view on things.
Yeah. That's valid. And I think that's going to be true in lots of scenarios. The advice I would give you is when you're done, you take a step back and think about what you've done. So let me put it to you in kind of numerical terms. Let's say you have a typical assignment. Maybe it's not super cookie cutter. Maybe it's kind of custom housing. There's a little bit of variety. You're going to earn your paycheck, and you execute this assignment, and you've got maybe 4 or 5 sale comps in this report. They're going to produce a range, right? And that range is not always super tight. Let's say it varies plus or minus 6 or 8% on either side of your opinion, which in your opinion is near that middle of that range because you're aiming for most probable, right? So that's a very typical scenario. And what that scenario tells me is that there's some uncertainty in the market data. And that uncertainty is like plus or minus that 6 or 8%, whatever it happens to be. That range represents the uncertainty measure in this particular submarket, right? For this particular property. Now, if you are worried about a time adjustment, trying to finesse it to 0.5 percentage point when you've got plus or minus 8% error in your overall analysis, yes, it does contribute to the error, but it's a relatively small part of the overall, uncertainty. And so you kind of do have to look at this through the lens of the uncertainty. If you got a comp where you're missing a plus 15% time adjustment, that may dwarf the rest of your uncertainty. If you got a comp where you're not sure of a plus or minus 1 or 2% on the time adjustment, it's probably not going to matter in the overall scheme of things. So we're looking at this through the same lens. There has to be a lot of room for interpretation for appraisers. The data is never going to be perfect. It's never going to point, well, I shouldn't say never. It rarely points to an extremely high precision, high confidence value. There's usually a lot of noise in these markets, right? And so you have to be able to navigate within that noise. And as consumers of the appraisal report, we recognize that and we make allowances for that. Where you get into trouble is when you don't recognize what's going on in the marketplace, or when you're doing something that's outside of that range of uncertainty, right? So that's how I'd look at it. Like, if your market is changing, you don't know how much because it's hard to analyze, but it's probably pretty stable. It's 2 or 3 or 4%. You take a stab at that, you can't be that far off because these are small numbers. It's much different than if you're adjusting for a barn that's 30% of the total value, right? So don't overthink it. Pick your best techniques, execute them, and be happy. We're going to be happy. That's much better than doing nothing.
Thanks.
The question about appraisal waivers, given that there's likely a new director of FHFA here as the administration changes, do you see any changes to how appraisal waivers are going to be in the future, or is it too soon to tell that?
Well, I can't speak for the the director of FHFA. I will say that Fannie Mae has been doing some version of appraisal waivers for 26 years at least, and that the rates today, execution rates on appraisal waivers are about 12, 13%. It's not that very different from what it was pre-pandemic, not very different from what it was 25 years ago. The difference is we're being more transparent and we're being more rigorous. We're anchoring it more to a collateral question as opposed to a credit question. But in terms of how it's going to impact appraisers, it's not going to have very big impact on appraisers. And appraisers shouldn't think of it as, oh my gosh, I'm missing out on 12% of my assignments. You're missing out on 12% that you have always been missing out on because we've been doing this kind of thing forever, right? And the amount of work you get is much more tied to interest rates than it is to appraisal waivers. We could retire appraisal waivers and get appraisals on everything, but there's two things that would happen. Number one, we'd be wasting people's money because you're buying an appraisal where there's no question to answer. Like you can't define a scope of work because there's no problem to solve. We already know what the answer is. So why should we waste our money on that? Or it's not our money, it's the consumer's money, right? And the second thing that would happen is some appraisers would muff it and get themselves into trouble over it. So I'm sparing you the problem, right? But the appraisal waivers are the safest cut of collateral issues in our pipeline. And right now, they're pretty low rates. When things get busy and get hopping, again, I point to liquidity as being one of our statutory obligations. And if someone has to wait 12 weeks for an appraisal, that's not a liquid market. So this is part of our toolkit to ensure liquidity in the marketplace.
All right, thanks, Lyle. There are a couple more questions that are in there with different topics, and that is, we discussed making other adjustments in the appraisals, and what is Fannie Mae's position on the use of qualitative analysis? I know, what was it, the Form 2065 used to be pretty popular, but now I probably haven't seen the 2065 in 10 years, but so it seems
we
that
don't
Fannie Mae
allow
is
the
complete.
2065 anymore. We moved away from that.
Yeah.
So that's one reason why you probably don't see it. Yeah, I get your question. I like qualitative analysis. I think it provides a good gut check on what you're doing. There might be some niche-y type situations where it's the only thing you have, so that's fine. Again, a thoughtful process where you're looking at the available data and you're looking at the way markets work and you're drawing rational conclusions from that is always going to trump some sort of repetitive, thought-free, exercise. So, yeah, qualitative is good. Quantitative is even better because qualitative can mislead you, but it's acceptable for it's a great technique for a lot of different things.
Yeah. Okay, and question on lender training. It seems that, a lot of questions we get from lenders is when they don't understand some of those guidelines, the 15%, the 25%, they think that is written in stone, and, we get feedback on that, you exceeded 15%. How can you do that? You can't do that. Or that's the more common remark is you can't exceed 15%. Are there any steps that Fannie Mae is taking to better educate their lenders on guidelines instead of, set and fast hard rules?
Well, I'll give you two answers. First of all, thank you for that question. That's an important question. And George mentioned this in his introduction, the question of why are we doing this now? And the reason why we're doing this now is because it's easier to see the problem now than it ever has been before because there is more data now than there ever has been before. And it's easier to set an expectation that appraisers solve the problem because we know you can. That said, the real problem, when I talk to appraisers and I say, how come you didn't make a time adjustment? You know, it seems like circumstances warranted one. The response I usually get, the most frequent response I get, is my lender doesn't want to see time adjustments. Okay. So part of that is, you know, appraisers need to stand up to the lenders, but you can't just be contrarian, right? They'll not do business with you. They want collaborative people. So you have to educate them. So part of it's on the burden is on the appraiser to educate how important this is. But I recognize Fannie Mae also has a burden here. And the reason why we put this in the selling guide the way we did is because the selling guide is not an appraisal manual, it's a lending manual. It's the instruction for the lender. So now we have it in black and white to the lender. There must be time adjustments. We expect it. And if any lender ever says to you, I don't want to see time adjustments, you go to our selling guide, you snip that out and you say, but Fannie Mae requires me to do this. I cannot skip this. They require you to do this. This is in your contract with them. Okay. So we're trying to educate them because they do pay attention to the selling guide. They do try to implement it. But also it gives you a resource that you can then point to in your conversations with the lenders to say, I know that you have to do this. I'm trying to help you, right?
George here, this is a good segue here. A couple of people asked this question of me prior to this meeting. Is how is Fannie and Freddie going to be dealing with reviewers, underwriters, risk analysts, underwriters on this very topic? Would classes like this help them? I guess. How are you going to be approaching the people that are going to be beating up on us?
Well, we do have kind of a standardized educational program for lenders. So we publish a lot of documents. We haven't figured out exactly how to get their attention other than issuing repurchases, which everybody hates, right? And so I think there's going to be some this change gives our QC team something really explicit and definitive in the selling guide to anchor a defect to. And that defect notification goes to the lender, right? And that gets their attention. So that's the number one mechanism. But then we have all of our published materials, which we really try and encourage lenders to study and to learn from.
Very good. Well, I'd like to thank you again, Lyle. You're certainly welcome to stick around for the 2-hour webinar. It would be great to have you because we'll be digging deeper into many of these questions. I just have a couple of slides here to wrap it up. Then we'll take about a half-hour break. Let's see, where are we going? Oh, Q&A. Oh, we did the Q&A. We had some prepared questions. Wrap it up. The next step is the introduction to market analysis class, 2 hours. Next up. We will present the 7-point checklist for reviewers and appraisers, to kind of cover over what our primary class covers, and preparing for the future with price indexing and data science and evidence-based valuation. Time adjustment in short, what we do is, remember, this is what as appraisers, we get the mechanics. We got to download the data, we got to reduce it to what's relevant, like USPAP says. Present the illustration. We use graphs. It involves usually a download of something like this. The issue we run into as a practical matter, no matter what software you use, is getting the field names right. Every MLS in the country has different field names, so it's a challenge. I'm on the UAD committee for the Collateral Risk Network, and in a year or two when that comes in, that's going to help a lot. But right now, that's a challenge for appraisers, just changing the field names before you can even do a good analysis. The method we suggest is an ideal method that economists, statisticians use. This is the ideal. This is not always possible. You got time on the x-axis down here, measures in days, and dollars on the y-axis. And this dot here means that you got a sale at this price, about 1,000,001 on this date here. So that this is a good way of describing the market segment you're dealing with. This is getting right down to the what's competing with the subject property. How is that market segment doing? So behind that sloped line is a simple equation. It's a simple regression. One predictor variable, one predicted variable, and that number is your dollars per day, which can be converted easily to a percentage for the front of the form. So closing thoughts is please hang around, stay for the market analysis class. It'd be great to have you, Lyle, if you could possibly make it. We're going to go over the different methods that are suggested by FHFA, that were mentioned by the Fannie guidelines, that are acceptable, and kind of take a look at those and what's better and what worse, and what do you have to do sometimes when you just can't do anything else. We're going to look more deeply at the time series analysis using the right data. Well, you've heard all this before. We do believe that the best method is fast and fun if you have the data, and we show you how to expand the data set if necessary. And I'm optimistic. I really want to close with this. I really see this as a way of making appraisers more relevant to the world, more relevant, more trusted. When I became an appraiser, I was seen as an authority figure. And somehow we lost that. I'm more like the clown now, I feel like sometimes. We can regain that back with the competence and the knowledge and using the data that's available today and the power of the computer. The analytics software, the graphs is so easy once you've done it 2 or 3 times, like Lyle said. We'll show you how to do at least one method, 3 different tools. How to do it in spreadsheet. I'll do a very quick thing on that. It takes about 5 minutes. We'll do it in our studio and a more extended example of that. And we'll have 2 presentations, one by Kyle and one by Craig, on 2 different artificial intelligence programs where you really, what it really emphasizes is the need for the competence of the expert. That's you and me. The tools become easier and easier and easier. It's knowing when and how to apply them, and the sequence, the hierarchy of what's better and what's worse, like Lyle mentioned. Lyle, thanks so much. If you can't hang around, I really appreciate you. We'll see you all back here about on the hour. In California, that's 11 p.m. If you're back east, that's 2 p.m.